We move now to Dorothy Kelso, who's Director and Head of Strategy and Research at the African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. She's also in our Cape Town studio to talk about the African private equity landscape. Well, good morning to you, Dorothy. Let's describe that landscape at the moment. Private equity has had a lot of press in recent years. There have been a lot of activities by private equity players. Some concerns over whether anyone regulates them or controls them. Tell us the state of play.
The current landscape in private equity in Africa is basically that we're having a broader and deeper GP landscape. So GPs are general partners, private equity firms. You're getting the Pan-African GPs developing. You're getting the regional private equity firms developing, and you're getting more sophistication also at the domestic and local level.
Well, and looking at the South African element of this, a lot of South African companies and players are moving into Africa. The point has been made that Africa is not a place. There are lots of countries in Africa that have their own individual imperatives. So how is the South African private equity industry, which is substantial, its relationships, its expansions into Africa? What's your sense of that?
The South African industry is, at the moment, looking outside its own borders. So you have the portfolio companies of private equity firms looking to buy assets in the rest of Africa. You look at traditional private equity firms within South Africa themselves looking to expand. For example, you have groups like Vantage, who are looking outside the borders of South Africa right now. And you're looking at the big corporations in South Africa looking to buy assets in the growth markets of Nigeria, for example. But to your point about the rest of Africa, we have very positive demographic growth story going on, a large middle class, for example, high population growth, high economic growth. So there are huge opportunities for growth in the rest of Africa. And what we're actually seeing right now in private equity is that more deals are being done in East and West Africa than are being done in South Africa, the more mature market. So those are the growth areas, East and West Africa at the moment.
Interesting. We were talking earlier this morning about the oil price, and if it goes below a certain level, it raises questions about the viability of some of the new projects on the East Coast, for example. So private equity players have to be careful here. What looked like great investments 3 months ago might not look like that now. What is the international view of African prospects in light of things like the oil price?
The oil price story is a transient one, and private equity firms, as you know, are long-term investors. And a lot of the private equity investment in Africa actually has been into consumer industries, consumer goods, for example, financial services, rather than the oil industry. So the changes in the oil price don't directly impact private equity investment. And what we're seeing increasingly, in addition to the consumer goods and investments, we're seeing investments in hard assets like infrastructure, for example, real estate, and in energy, you know, supporting some of, for example, Ghana gets lots of blackouts. We're seeing private equity firms beginning to be more interested in energy investments. So those sorts of investments are long-term and not necessarily dependent on these sort of short-term blips in oil prices.
Well, you've been speaking, Dorothy, with American institutional investors recently about African private equity. What's the view from there?
We're finding that a lot of the large North American pension funds that have traditionally been slower in looking at Africa are increasingly formulating the Africa investment strategy. And you're talking about sort of pots of money of, you know, billions of dollars looking at Africa. And the potential, obviously, for investment is huge and significant across all the 54 countries of Africa. We do a survey. We found that 85% of limited partners are looking to increase their exposure to Africa in the medium term. So very much, you know, big sources of capital looking to invest in Africa. You've got that sophisticated private equity landscape I mentioned earlier in terms of you've got Pan-African private equity firms to invest in, regional private equity firms, and domestic private equity firms to invest in. And to add another trend we're seeing deepening capital structures. So whereas equity has been the traditional investment into private equity companies, we're seeing debt and mezzanine emerging across Africa, not just in South Africa.
Well, thanks to Dorothy Kelso. She is Director and Head of Strategy and Research at the African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association.